The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. David sat on the edge of his worn couch, holding a small, wrapped box in his hands. The wrapping paper was from last year, carefully saved and reused. Inside was a second-hand doll he'd found at the thrift store for $3. It was the only Christmas gift he could afford for his daughter this year. 8-year-old Lily was asleep in the bedroom, probably dreaming about what Santa might bring. David's heart felt heavy. She'd asked for so little this year, just a new doll and maybe some art supplies. She'd seen other kids at school with their tablets and fancy toys, but she never complained. That made it hurt even more. 6 months ago, David had been laid off from the factory where he'd worked for 12 years. They'd called it downsizing, given him 2 weeks of severance pay, and that was it. He'd applied everywhere: fast food places, grocery stores, warehouses, even cleaning jobs. Some places never called back. Others said he was overqualified. A few gave him a couple of shifts, and then stopped putting him on the schedule. The bills had piled up quickly. First, he'd used his savings. Then, he'd sold his TV, his watch, his tools, anything with value. He'd kept Lily's things untouched. She'd already lost so much. Her mother, Rachel, had left them 3 years ago. Just packed a bag one morning and said she couldn't do this anymore. No explanation that made sense. No goodbye to Lily. Just gone. David had been both mother and father since then, and he'd managed okay until the layoff. But now, 2 months behind on rent, the landlord was making threats. The heat barely worked. Their meals were mostly rice, beans, and whatever was cheapest at the discount grocery store. He looked at the small plastic tree in the corner. It was the same one they'd had for 5 years, missing several branches and leaning to one side. Under it sat that single present. Last Christmas, even though money was tight, there had been at least 5 or 6 gifts. This year, there was one. David stood up and walked to the window. Snow was falling outside, covering the street in white. It was beautiful. But all he could think about was how cold the apartment would be tonight. He'd kept the heat off during the day to save money, only turning it on for a few hours in the evening when Lily was home. He checked his wallet. $18. That was all the money he had until next week, when his unemployment check would come. If it came. There had been issues with his last claim, some paperwork problem he didn't fully understand. David walked quietly to Lily's room and opened the door a crack. She was sleeping peacefully. Her brown hair spread across the pillow. She looked so much like Rachel. Same smile, same stubborn chin. But unlike her mother, Lily was tough. She never quit on anything or anyone. At school, her teacher had pulled David aside last week. She'd noticed that Lily wasn't eating much lunch and asked if everything was okay at home. David had lied, said she was just a picky eater. The truth was, he'd been packing smaller lunches to make their food last longer. The teacher had looked at him with kind eyes that saw right through the lie. But she didn't push. She'd just said that the school had programs that could help if needed. David had nodded and left quickly, his pride stinging. He'd always taken care of his family. Always provided. Now he couldn't even pack his daughter a decent lunch. He closed her door softly and went back to the living room. On the small table by the couch was a notice from the church downtown. They were having a Christmas Eve service and mentioned something about a food pantry. David wasn't a religious man, hadn't been to church since he was a kid, but desperate times called for desperate measures. It was almost 11 o'clock at night. The church stayed open late on Christmas Eve for people to come and pray. Maybe, just maybe, someone would still be there. Maybe they'd have something extra, some food he could bring home. Tomorrow was Christmas, and he wanted to give Lily more than just that one small gift. He grabbed a piece of paper and wrote a note. Lily, if you wake up, I went to get something. Be back soon. Stay inside and keep the door locked. Love, Dad. He put it on her pillow, knowing she probably wouldn't wake up. But just in case. The coat he put on had a broken zipper and a torn pocket, but it was warm enough. He'd given Lily his better jacket last month when hers got too small. David locked the door behind him and started walking. He couldn't afford the bus, so walking the 15 blocks to the church was his only option. The cold hit him immediately. His breath came out in clouds, and the wind cut through his thin coat. The streets were mostly empty. Everyone else was home with their families, warm and celebrating. Windows glowed with Christmas lights and decorated trees. David could hear laughter and music from some of the houses he passed. He thought about last Christmas. It hadn't been great, but they'd been okay. He'd still had his job then. He'd made a turkey, even if it was a small one. Lily had gotten some presents, nothing fancy, but she'd been happy. They'd watched Christmas movies together and eaten too much pie. This year, there would be no turkey, no pie. Just that one present under a broken tree, and whatever he could scrape together from the church pantry. David's hands were numb by the time he reached Main Street. The snow was coming down harder now, sticking to his hair and eyelashes. His feet were cold inside his old work boots. The sole on the left one had a hole in it that he'd tried to patch with cardboard, but the moisture was seeping through. He was 3 blocks from the church when something made him stop. It was a sound, faint but distinct. At first, he thought maybe it was the wind or a car in the distance. But then he heard it again. It sounded like crying. David looked around. The street was empty. Most of the buildings here were closed for the holiday, their windows dark. The crying sound came again. And this time, he could tell it was coming from the alley next to an old abandoned building. Every instinct told him to keep walking. This neighborhood wasn't the safest, especially at night. It could be a setup. Someone trying to lure him into the alley to rob him. He had almost nothing, but they wouldn't know that until it was too late. But the sound came again, and something about it made his feet move toward the alley entrance. It didn't sound like an adult. It sounded small, weak, desperate. David pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The battery was at 12%. He shone it into the alley, his heart pounding. The crying was louder now, more urgent. What he saw made him freeze in place, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. There, next to a dumpster, partially hidden behind some cardboard boxes and garbage bags, was a bundle of blankets, and the crying was coming from inside those blankets. David moved closer, his hands shaking. He knelt down and carefully pulled back the top layer of fabric. Inside was a baby. David's mind went blank for a moment. He just stared, unable to move. A baby. A real, living baby, lying in a cardboard box in an alley on Christmas Eve. The infant's face was purple from crying, tiny fists waving in the freezing air. The blankets wrapped around the small body were thin, barely enough to keep anyone warm, let alone a newborn. How long had this baby been out here? Minutes? Hours? The temperature was well below freezing, and the snow was still falling. David looked around frantically, searching for anyone who might be nearby. A mother who'd just stepped away for a moment. Someone who could explain this. The alley was empty. Just trash, snow, and this tiny life, fighting to survive. The baby's cries were getting weaker, more desperate. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around the bundle of blankets, then scooped the baby up and held the infant against his chest. The little body was so cold. Too cold. David could feel it even through the layers of fabric. He turned and started running back the way he'd come. The church was 3 blocks away, but that felt like 3 miles. His lungs burned as he ran through the snow, one arm wrapped protectively around the baby, the other trying to shield the infant from the wind. "It's okay," he said, though he didn't know if that was true. "It's okay. I've got you. You're going to be okay." The baby had stopped crying. That scared David more than the crying had. He pressed his hand against the blankets, feeling for movement. for breathing. There. A small rise and fall. Still alive. Still fighting. David's feet slipped on the icy sidewalk, and he nearly fell. He caught himself at the last second, protecting the baby with his body. His knee hit the concrete hard, pain shooting up his leg, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The church appeared ahead, its windows glowing with warm light. David could see someone inside, moving around near the front doors. He ran faster, ignoring the burning in his chest and the sharp pain in his knee. He burst through the church doors so hard they slammed against the walls. An older man in priest's clothing spun around, startled. He was holding a broom and had been sweeping near the entrance. "Help!" David gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Please. I found a baby. In an alley. She's freezing." The priest dropped the broom and rushed over. His eyes widened when he saw the bundle in David's arms. "Dear God. Come with me, quickly." They moved into a small office, off to the side where the heat was stronger. The priest called out, and a woman appeared from another room. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun. "Call 911, Helen," the priest said urgently. "We have an abandoned infant." Quote. Helen pulled out her phone immediately, her fingers moving fast as she dialed. The priest guided David to a chair and carefully took the baby from his arms. He unwrapped the layers of blankets in David's coat, checking the infant over with practiced hands. "She's hypothermic," the priest said quietly. "But she's breathing. Her pulse is there. You found her just in time." David watched as the priest grabbed a clean blanket from a cabinet and wrapped the baby in it, then held her close to his own body, using his warmth to help her. The baby's face was starting to look less purple, more pink. Her eyes were closed, but her tiny chest was moving up and down. Helen spoke rapidly into the phone, giving the church's address and explaining the situation. When she hung up, she came over and looked at the baby with tears in her eyes. "Poor little thing," she whispered. "Who would do such a thing?" David didn't have an answer. He was shaking now, and not just from the cold. The adrenaline that had carried him through the last 10 minutes was wearing off, leaving him weak and overwhelmed. "What's your name, son?" the priest asked. "David." "David Chen. I'm Father Tom, and this is Helen, my wife. She volunteers here at the church. You did a good thing tonight, David. A very good thing." David nodded but couldn't speak. He kept looking at the baby, this tiny person who'd been left to die in an alley. What kind of desperation would drive someone to do that? He thought about Lily, about how much he loved her, how he'd do anything to protect her. How could someone abandon their child like this? Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Within minutes, the church was filled with people. 2 police officers arrived first, followed quickly by an ambulance. The paramedics took over, checking the baby's vital signs, wrapping her in heated blankets, preparing to transport her to the hospital. One of the police officers, a young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, sat down with David to get his statement. Her name tag read, "Officer Martinez, can you tell me exactly what happened?" she asked, her voice gentle, but professional. David told her everything. How he'd been walking to the church, heard crying, found the baby in the alley. He described the location, the cardboard box, the thin blankets. Officer Martinez wrote it all down, asking occasional questions for clarification. "Did you see anyone else in the area? Anyone walking away or watching?" David shook his head. "Nobody. The streets were empty." Quote, "And you didn't move anything else at the scene? Didn't see a note? Or any identification?" "No. I just grabbed her and ran. I was afraid she was dying." Officer Martinez nodded, her expression softening. "You probably saved her life. Another hour out there, in this cold." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The other officer was on his radio, calling for additional units to check the alley and canvass the area. They'd look for cameras, witnesses, anything that might help them figure out who'd left the baby there. The paramedics were ready to leave. One of them, a man with gray hair and tired eyes, came over to David. "You want to ride with us to the hospital? We'll need someone to give more information to the doctors." David thought about Lily. Alone in the apartment. He looked at his phone. It was almost midnight. He needed to get home. But something made him hesitate. This baby, this tiny stranger, had become his responsibility the moment he'd picked her up. He couldn't just walk away now. "I need to call my daughter first," David said. He dialed their home number. The phone rang 4 times before Lily answered, her voice groggy with sleep. "Dad. Hey, sweetheart. I'm sorry to wake you. Did you see my note?" "Yeah. Where are you?" "I'm at the church, but I need to go to the hospital for a little while." Something happened. Something important. "I found a baby. Lily. Someone left a baby outside in the cold, and I need to make sure she's okay." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Lily said, "Is the baby going to be all right?" "I think so. Because we found her in time." "That's good, Dad. That's really good." Lily's voice was more awake now, filled with concern. "You should stay with her." "I'm okay here. I'll lock the door and go back to sleep." "You sure?" "Yeah. The baby needs you more than I do right now. I'll see you in the morning." David felt his throat tighten. His daughter, who had so little, was telling him to stay and help someone else. "I love you, Lily." "Love you too, Dad. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." He hung up and looked at Officer Martinez. "I'll go to the hospital." The ride in the ambulance was surreal. David sat in the back, watching the paramedics work on the baby. They had an IV started now, fluids running to help warm her from the inside. Her color was better, and she was making small sounds, not quite crying but not silent either. "She's a fighter," one of the paramedics said, smiling at David. David looked down at his hands. They were red from the cold, shaking slightly. He'd gone out tonight looking for food to make Christmas better for Lily. Instead, he'd found something else entirely. Someone else who needed help even more than they did. As the ambulance pulled up to the emergency room entrance, David wondered what would happen next. The emergency room was chaos. Even on Christmas Eve, or maybe especially on Christmas Eve, the waiting area was packed with people. A kid with a broken arm sat with his parents. An elderly man coughed into a tissue. Someone was arguing with the front desk about insurance. David followed the paramedics through the double doors marked, "Authorized personnel only." They wheeled the baby straight back to a trauma room, where a team of doctors and nurses were already waiting. The medical staff moved like a choreographed dance, each person knowing exactly what to do. "Newborn female, approximately 3 to 5 days old," one of the paramedics reported. "Found abandoned in an alley, exposed to temperatures around 20 degrees for unknown duration. Hypothermic on arrival. Core temp was 92 degrees. We've been warming her slowly. Started an IV. Given warm fluids. She's responded well." A young doctor with dark circles under her eyes took over, listening to the baby's heart and lungs with a stethoscope. "Let's get her under the warmer. I want a full panel, chest X-ray, and keep monitoring that core temperature." "Good work getting her here." David stood awkwardly near the door, not sure if he should stay or go. A nurse noticed him and walked over. She was older, with kind eyes and gray streaks in her black hair. "You're the one who found her?" she asked. David nodded. "Come with me. Let the doctors work. You can wait in the family room, and someone will update you soon." She led him to a small room down the hall with a couch, a few chairs, and a coffee maker that looked like it had been there since the 1980s. The walls were painted a pale blue that was probably supposed to be calming, but just looked sad. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine," David said, though he wasn't sure that was true. He sat down on the couch, and the nurse left, closing the door most of the way. David pulled out his phone. The battery was down to 4%. He thought about calling Lily again but decided against it. She needed to sleep. He'd be home soon enough. He sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. His mind kept replaying the moment he'd found the baby. That tiny face, purple from the cold, those weak cries. If he'd walked a different route, if he'd been 5 minutes later, if he hadn't stopped to investigate the sound. The door opened, and Officer Martinez came in, followed by an older officer with sergeant stripes on his sleeve. "Mr. Chen," the sergeant said, shaking David's hand. "I'm Sergeant Williams. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did tonight. You saved that little girl's life." David didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "We need to ask you a few more questions, if that's all right. My officers are at the scene now, trying to piece together what happened." They went through everything again. David described the exact location, the condition of the baby, everything he could remember. Sergeant Williams took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. "Did you notice anything unusual in the area? Any cars parked nearby? Any signs that someone had been there recently? Besides the baby?" David thought hard. There was a lot of trash. The cardboard box she was in looked new, though. Not wet or beaten up, like it had been there for days. "That matches what we're seeing at the scene," Officer Martinez added. "We think the baby was placed there within the last hour or two before you found her." "Have you found the mother?" David asked. "Not yet. We're checking cameras in the area, talking to anyone who might have seen something. But it's Christmas Eve, and a lot of places are closed. Most people are home." The doctor from earlier knocked on the open door and stepped inside. She looked tired but was smiling slightly. "The baby's going to be fine," she said. "Her core temperature is back to normal. No signs of frostbite. She's a little dehydrated and underweight, but nothing that won't improve with proper care." "Mr. Chen, if you'd found her even an hour later, we'd be having a very different conversation. You should be proud of yourself." David felt relief wash over him. "Can I see her?" "Of course. Follow me." They left the officers in the family room and walked back toward the trauma area. The baby had been moved to a regular room, away from the chaos of the emergency department. She was lying in a clear plastic bassinet under a warming light, wearing a tiny hospital gown and a knit cap. Her eyes were closed, and she was sleeping peacefully. "She's had formula and kept it down," the doctor said. David stood next to the bassinet, looking down at this tiny person he'd found just hours ago. She looked so peaceful now, so different from the desperate infant crying in that alley. "What happens to her now?" he asked. The doctor's smile faded a bit. "Child Protective Services has been notified. They'll take over custody once we're ready to discharge her. She'll be placed in emergency foster care while they search for her family or permanent placement." "How long does that take?" "It depends. If they can't locate the parents, and it doesn't look like they will based on what the police are telling us, then she'll go into the foster system. Could be weeks or months before a permanent home is found. The system is overwhelmed, especially with infants." David nodded, still looking at the baby. He thought about Lily's question on the phone. "Is the baby going to be all right?" At the time, he'd thought she was asking about the baby's health, but now, he wondered if Lily had meant something bigger than that. The door opened again, and a woman in business casual clothes came in carrying a tablet and a large bag. She looked to be in her 50s, with short gray hair and glasses. "Mr. Chen, I'm Patricia from Child Protective Services. I wanted to meet you, and thank you for what you did tonight." They shook hands. Patricia's grip was firm and warm. "The police filled me in on everything. You're a real hero." David shook his head. "I just did what anyone would do." "You'd be surprised," Patricia said, her tone turning sad. "A lot of people would have walked right past, or called 911 without getting involved. You didn't just call for help, you saved her yourself." She looked at the baby in the bassinet, and her expression softened. Poor little thing. Someone's crisis became her tragedy. "What do you mean?" David asked. Patricia sighed. In my line of work, you see this more than you'd like. A young mother, probably scared and desperate. Maybe she had no support, no money, no way to care for a baby. Instead of leaving the child at a safe haven location like a hospital or fire station, she panicked. Left the baby somewhere she hoped someone would find her, but didn't think through how dangerous it was. Will you find the mother? Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, this baby needs a home. David watched the baby's small chest rise and fall with each breath. You said she'd go into foster care? Yes. Emergency placement first. Probably by tomorrow, if we can arrange it. Then longer-term foster care, while we work through the legal process of termination of parental rights and adoption. How does someone become a foster parent? Patricia looked at him with interest. Are you asking generally, or for a specific reason? David wasn't sure why he'd asked. The question had just come out. I don't know. Just curious, I guess. Well, there's a process. Background checks, home studies, training classes. It usually takes several months. Why do you ask? David looked at Patricia, then back at the baby. He thought about his empty apartment, his unemployment, his inability to even give Lily a proper Christmas. What was he thinking? But then he remembered holding this baby in his arms, running through the snow, feeling her cold body start to warm against his chest. He remembered Lily's voice on the phone, telling him to stay because the baby needed him. I want to help her, David said quietly. I know I'm not in the best situation right now. I lost my job 6 months ago. Money is tight. Really tight. But I have a daughter, Lily. She's 8. And I know how to take care of kids. Patricia studied him for a long moment. Mr. Chen, that's a very kind impulse. But foster care is a big commitment. It's not just about wanting to help. There are financial requirements, space requirements, stability requirements. I know, David said. I'm probably not qualified. I can't stop thinking about what happens to her. Where she goes. If she'll be okay. Patricia's expression changed. She pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for David to do the same. Tell me about your situation, she said. Your daughter, your home, your plans. So David did. He told her everything. David told Patricia everything. About losing his job at the factory. About Rachel leaving 3 years ago. About raising Lily on his own. He told her about the $18 in his wallet, about being 2 months behind on rent, about the single present under their broken Christmas tree. He didn't leave anything out. What was the point of lying? Patricia listened without interrupting, her face neutral and professional. When David finished, he expected her to thank him politely and explain why he wasn't suitable to be a foster parent. Instead, she surprised him. Mr. Chen, can I be honest with you? Please. What you did tonight shows character. Real character. You were on your way to a food pantry because your own family needs help. But when you found this baby, you didn't hesitate. You didn't think about yourself. You just acted. She paused, looking at the sleeping infant. That's rare, but I don't have money, David said. I can barely take care of my own daughter. Foster parents receive monthly support payments, Patricia explained. It's not a lot, but it covers the child's needs. Formula, diapers, clothes, medical care. The state provides all of that. We also help with things like cribs and car seats. David felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. But he pushed it down. Even so, I don't have space. We live in a 1-bedroom apartment. Lily sleeps in the bedroom, and I sleep on the couch. Patricia nodded. That's not ideal. But for emergency foster placement, we can work with it temporarily. The baby would sleep in your room, probably in a bassinet, next to your daughter's bed. Later, if this became permanent, you'd need to find a bigger place. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. I don't understand. Are you saying I could actually do this? I'm saying it's possible. Not easy, but possible. Here's what would happen. First, we'd do an emergency placement evaluation. That's faster than the normal foster care approval process. Usually takes a few days instead of months. We'd visit your home, do a background check, interview you and your daughter. If everything checks out, the baby could be placed with you temporarily while we search for her family. David's mind was racing. And if you don't find her family, then we'd start the process of converting your emergency placement to regular foster care, with the possibility of adoption down the line. But that's a long road, David. Months, probably over a year. You'd need to complete all the training, maintain a stable home environment, and prove you can care for 2 children. What about my job situation? Patricia smiled slightly. Funny thing about that. Being a foster parent, especially to an infant, requires someone to be home a lot. Many foster parents don't work traditional full-time jobs, at least not at first. The state support isn't enough to live on. But combined with unemployment benefits and part-time work, people make it work. David looked at the baby again. She made a small sound in her sleep, her tiny hand curling into a fist. Can I think about it? Of course. But I need to be clear about something. This baby needs emergency placement by tomorrow, Christmas Day. If you're serious about this, we'd need to start the evaluation process immediately. Like, today. Now. Now? It's almost 2 a.m. on Christmas. I know. But that's the reality of child welfare. Emergencies don't wait for business hours. If you're interested, I can make some calls. Get the process started. We could visit your home later this morning, talk to your daughter, see if this might work. David's heart was pounding. This was crazy. Completely insane. He'd gone out looking for food, and somehow ended up considering taking in an abandoned baby. What would Lily think? What would their landlord say? How would they manage? But then he thought about that alley. About how close this baby had come to dying alone in the cold. About how she deserved a chance. Just like everyone deserves a chance. Let me call my daughter, David said. Patricia nodded and stepped out of the room to give him privacy. David pulled out his phone. 3% battery left. He dialed home. Lily answered on the first ring. Dad? Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm sorry to call again so late. It's okay. I couldn't really sleep anyway. Is the baby all right? She's going to be fine. The doctors say she'll make a full recovery. That's good. I've been praying for her. I know we don't usually pray, but it seemed like a good time to start. Lo. David felt his eyes sting with tears. Lily, I need to ask you something important. It's about the baby. Lily. Lily, I need to wake. 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 Okay. The lady from Child Services says the baby needs a home. She asked if we might consider taking care of her for a while. I know it sounds crazy. I know we're already struggling. But I wanted to ask what you think. There was silence on the other end. David waited. His heart in his throat. You mean like, she'd live with us? Lily finally asked. Yes. Temporarily at first. Maybe longer if things work out. But it would change everything. She'd need to sleep in your room. We'd have to share everything we have, which isn't much. It would be hard, Lily. Really hard. More silence. Then Lily said something that made David's decision for him. Dad, you always tell me that the right thing and the easy thing are hardly ever the same thing. This baby doesn't have anyone. We don't have much, but we have love. We have each other. Doesn't she deserve that too? David closed his eyes. His 8-year-old daughter understood something that a lot of adults never figured out. Are you sure? I'm sure. Bring her home, Dad. Let's give her a real Christmas. I love you so much, Lily. Love you too. And Dad, this is better than any present. This is the best Christmas ever. David hung up and wiped his eyes. When Patricia came back in, he didn't need to say anything. She could see the answer on his face. Okay, she said, a genuine smile crossing her features. Let's get started. I'll need your address, and I'll have someone meet us at your apartment in a few hours. In the meantime, I need you to fill out some initial paperwork. The next few hours passed in a blur. David filled out forms, answered questions, and drank terrible hospital coffee to stay awake. Father Tom and his wife Helen arrived around 4 in the morning with clothes and supplies they'd gathered from the church's donation closet. They'd heard what David was trying to do and wanted to help. This is what Christmas is about, Father Tom said, pressing a bag of baby items into David's hands. Not the presents or the decorations. It's about making room in your life for those who need it most. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, David found himself sitting in Patricia's car as she drove him home. The baby was still at the hospital, but would be discharged later that day if the home evaluation went well. In the back seat were bags of donated baby supplies. More than David had seen, in one place in a long time. They pulled up to his apartment building just as the sun was rising. The building looked even more run down in the morning light. Cracked siding, broken steps, trash scattered around the parking lot. David felt embarrassed. It's not much, he said. Patricia turned off the car and looked at him. David, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've seen mansions where children were neglected and tiny apartments where they were loved. Space and money matter, but they're not everything. What matters most is heart. And you have that. They walked up to the apartment. David unlocked the door, and there was Lily. Wide awake even though it was barely 6 in the morning. She'd cleaned the entire apartment. The dishes were done, the floors were swept, and she'd even tried to fix the leaning Christmas tree. Hi, Lily said, shyly to Patricia. I'm Lily. Is the baby coming home today? Patricia knelt down to Lily's level. Maybe. That depends on a lot of things. I need to ask you some questions first. Is that okay? Lily nodded seriously. I'll tell you the truth. About everything. Patricia smiled. They sat at the small kitchen table, and Patricia began her evaluation. She asked Lily about school, about her relationship with her father, about how she felt about having a baby in the house. Lily answered every question thoughtfully, her maturity shining through. Then Patricia walked through the apartment, taking notes. David watched nervously as she checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the small kitchen. She tested the smoke detector, looked in the cabinets, checked the windows. Finally, she came back to the living room where David and Lily waited. Mr. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. This apartment is small. The building has issues. You're in a tough financial situation. She paused, and David's heart sank. But then Patricia continued. However, this home is clean. It's safe. And most importantly, it's filled with love. I'm going to recommend emergency placement approval. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. Really? Really. We'll need to do follow-up visits. And you'll need to start the full foster care certification process. But for now, yes. You can bring that baby home. Lily jumped up and hugged David. He held her tight, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. They brought the baby home on Christmas afternoon. Patricia had arranged for a car seat, a bassinet, formula, diapers, and everything else they'd need for the first few weeks. Father Tom and Helen had organized a small collection from church members, and donations kept arriving throughout the day. Baby clothes, blankets, bottles, things David never could have afforded on his own. Lily insisted on carrying the diaper bag up the stairs while David carefully held the car seat with the sleeping baby inside. It felt surreal, walking into their tiny apartment with this new life they were now responsible for. What should we call her? Lily whispered. not wanting to wake the baby. David hadn't thought about that. The hospital had listed her as baby doe on the paperwork. I don't know. What do you think? Lily studied the baby's face for a long moment. What about hope? Because we found her on Christmas, and Christmas is about hope. Right? David felt his throat tighten. Hope. That's perfect. They set up the bassinet next to Lily's bed. The bedroom was crowded now, but Lily didn't complain. She helped David figure out how to change diapers, how to hold the bottle at the right angle, how to support Hope's tiny head. For someone who'd never been around babies, Lily was a natural. That first night was rough. Hope woke up every 2 hours crying, needing to be fed or changed. David was exhausted, but every time he held her, every time she stopped crying and looked up at him with those dark eyes, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore. He was starting to feel something deeper. The next few days were a blur of feedings and diaper changes and trying to figure out what different cries meant. Patricia visited twice to check on them, bringing more supplies each time. She taught David things the hospital staff hadn't covered, answered questions, and reassured him when he felt overwhelmed. You're doing great, she said during her second visit. Most first-time foster parents struggle a lot more than this. I don't feel like I'm doing great, David admitted. I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water. Patricia laughed. That's parenthood. But look at your daughter. Look how she's bonding with Hope. That's special. Ah, it was true. Lily had thrown herself into being a big sister with everything she had. She'd wake up early to help with morning feedings before school started back up. She'd sing to Hope when the baby was fussy. She'd even started reading her bedtime stories, even though Hope was way too young to understand them. The week after Christmas, David got a call that changed everything. It was from a hiring manager at a company where he'd applied months ago. They'd had someone back out of a position, and they wanted to know if David was still interested. The job was in a warehouse, doing inventory management. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady work with benefits. David almost cried on the phone. Yes. Absolutely yes. When can I start? How's next Monday? There was just one problem. If he took the job, who would watch Hope during the day? Patricia had said foster parents received support, but it wasn't enough to cover full-time childcare. David did the math in his head. Even with his new salary, daycare costs would eat up most of his paycheck. He called Patricia, explained the situation. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Let me make some calls, she said. There are programs that help foster parents with childcare costs. Give me a day. That evening, while David was feeding Hope and worrying about the future, there was a knock at the door. I heard about your job offer, she said, smiling. Father Tom and I have been talking. I'm retired, and I have a lot of free time. I'd like to help watch Hope while you're at work. No charge. David stared at her. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. I raised 4 kids of my own, and they're all grown now with families of their own. I miss having little ones around. Besides, you helped save this baby's life. Let us help you give her a good one. Mater. David didn't know what to say. He'd spent so long struggling alone. He'd forgotten what it felt like when people showed up to help. The weeks turned into months. David started his new job and found he was good at it. His boss was impressed with his work ethic and attention to detail. Helen watched Hope during the day, refusing to take any payment despite David's repeated offers. Patricia continued her visits, and David completed his foster care training classes on weekends. Hope was thriving. She was gaining weight, hitting her developmental milestones, and starting to smile and laugh. Lily was excelling in school, her confidence growing as she embraced her role as big sister. And David, for the first time in a long time, felt like he could breathe. In March, Patricia came by with news. The police had exhausted all leads, trying to find Hope's biological mother. No one had come forward. No missing person reports matched. No DNA hits in the system. After 3 months, the state was moving forward with termination of parental rights. What does that mean? David asked, though he already knew. It means Hope is free for adoption, and you have first priority if you want to adopt her. David looked at Hope, now 4 months old, lying on a blanket on the floor. Lily was playing with her, making her laugh by making funny faces. This baby who'd come into their lives on the worst Christmas David had ever faced had somehow made it the best. I want to adopt her, David said. If she'll have us. Patricia smiled. I think she already has. The adoption process took another 8 months. There were home studies, court dates, psychological evaluations, and mountains of paperwork. David had to prove he could provide a stable home, which meant finding a bigger apartment. With his new job and some help from a housing program for foster parents, he managed to move them into a small 2-bedroom place in a better neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but Lily had her own room, and Hope had a nursery. There was space for toys and books, and all the things that make a house a home. Finally, in November, almost a year after that Christmas Eve night, they stood in family court. Hope was 10 months old now, sitting on David's hip and chewing on his tie. Lily stood next to them, wearing a dress Helen had bought special for the occasion. Patricia was there too, along with Father Tom and Helen and a few other people from the church who'd become like family. The judge, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, reviewed all the paperwork. Then, she looked at David. Mr. Chen, do you understand that by granting this adoption, you will be legally and financially responsible for this child, as if she were your biological daughter? Yes, Your Honor. And you're prepared for that responsibility? David looked at Hope, who was trying to grab his glasses. He looked at Lily, who was watching with tears in her eyes. He thought about that night a year ago when he'd had nothing to give his daughter, when he'd felt like a failure as a father. Your Honor, this little girl saved my life just as much as I saved hers. I'm more than prepared. I'm honored. The judge smiled and brought down her gavel. Then, it's my pleasure to grant this adoption. Congratulations, Mr. Chen. Hope is officially your daughter. The courtroom erupted in applause. Lily rushed over and hugged both David and Hope. Patricia was crying. Helen was crying. Even the bailiff looked a little misty-eyed. That evening, they had a celebration dinner at the church. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad and cake that Helen had baked. But it felt like a feast. David sat with his 2 daughters, surrounded by people who'd become his support system, his community, his family. Father Tom stood up to make a toast. A year ago, David came to our church looking for help. He was at his lowest point, feeling like he had nothing to give. But that night, he gave everything he had to save a life. And in doing so, he saved 3 lives. His own, his daughter's, and little Hope's. David thought about that. It was true. Finding Hope hadn't just saved her. It had given David purpose, when he had none. It had taught Lily about compassion and sacrifice. It had connected them to a community of people who cared. Later that night, after they'd gotten home and put Hope to bed, Lily came and sat next to David on the couch. Dad, do you remember what I said last Christmas? About this being the best Christmas ever? I remember. I was right. But not just that Christmas. This whole year has been the best, even the hard parts. David put his arm around his daughter and pulled her close. You know what? You're absolutely right. He thought about that thrift store doll, still sitting in Lily's room, the one present he'd been able to afford last Christmas. It seemed like a lifetime ago. He'd been so worried about not having enough to give, about failing as a father. But he'd learned something important that year. Sometimes the greatest gifts aren't things you buy. They're the choices you make, the love you share, and the people you open your heart to when it would be easier to walk away. Hope started crying from the bedroom, probably needing another bottle. David got up to check on her, but Lily stopped him. I've got it, Dad. You rest. David watched his 8-year-old daughter, who wasn't so little anymore, go to care for her baby sister. He thought about everything that had changed in 1 year. A new job, a bigger apartment, a family that had grown from 2 to 3. But the biggest change was inside him. He was no longer the man who thought he had nothing to give. He'd discovered that even when you have nothing, you always have something. You have your time, your effort, your love, and sometimes, that's everything.